Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Again, my name is Dave Nagel. I'm very excited to share with my friends and colleagues in Central Unified this overview and review for some of visible learning and introduction to the visible learning research. So I'm going to just jump right in. When we look at John Hattie's work, one of the things he was focused on was always making sure that we were monitoring what is shown to have the greatest impact on student learning. And while achievement and learning are often synonymous, his focus was on learning and growth and not just achievement in and of itself, meaning not just that students passed the test or passed the assessment, but how much growth and progress were they making. So this is going to kind of highlight some of his research and some actions and takeaways we can apply from that. Background, most of you have a chance to know me. You've seen some of the other webinars. We've been in person, but my background was in secondary, middle school, and high school. But I present and consult across the country on all topics, visible learning being one specifically at all levels, and I've been very fortunate to twice be certified in John Hattie's visible learning work. So our success criteria for this specific webinar is by the end of this webinar, be able to articulate several findings from the visible learning research, be able to articulate what does Hattie's work really show us? What did it tell us? And then how we could possibly apply some of those visible learning research concepts, aspects of the visible learning research to our school, or even to our specific individual classroom setting. You have a working handout that kind of looks like this. And what I'm going to do is kind of dive in for an overview of several overarching pieces of Hattie's research, and then dive into 5 or 6 of the influences on a deeper level, and you can have some chance to take some notes and takeaways and ideas. With this particular webinar, I won't stop and pause the recording. Feel free to pause anytime you can, but just know that I'm going to kind of walk through, and you have a chance to kind of highlight when I get into those specific influences here in just a few minutes to jot some extra ideas down from your perspective. John Hattie's core message has always been to know thy impact, that our job as educators is to be evaluators, not evaluators of anyone else, but evaluators of our own impact that we're having on student learning, to make sure we're constantly monitoring how our actions are impacting the learners that we serve on a daily basis. It's also important, and I make this kind of joke tongue in cheek, but if you ever see a visible learning checklist, run, and run fast. It's not about the top 10. It's not about just looking at the top 10 list and doing those. And I'm going to kind of highlight some things that are related to the aspects that are in the highest influences and what we need to make sure we do, and even some influences that haven't shown to have the greatest impact on student learning, why they haven't, and what we can do differently when we apply some of those aspects in our schools with our students to make sure we're getting some of the greater impact on student learning that we should see, even though at times they haven't in the past, because maybe they were ineffectively implemented. So that slide's already been up there. What I've listed here, and this is a chance to kind of pause the recording if you need to, is approximately 15 influences from John Hattie's work. Take a moment and pause the recording and determine what you think would be the top 2 influences and then the bottom 2. Out of this list, what have had the greatest impact on student learning, and what might you see that hasn't had? So out of this list, take a moment and pick what you think would be the top 2 and the bottom 2. Pause the recording as long as you need. I'm going to pause for about 7 seconds and then show the ranking. Welcome back. So hopefully you've had a chance to decide what you think are the top 2. And here's what the order is. I'm going to come back to this. Pause if you need to, if you have a thought or a question or you want to take a look at it. But this is just only how they're ranked against each other. We've got to dig in now. I often say that we need Paul Harvey. We need the rest of the story. What John Hattie has done is he has taken time to synthesize what he calls meta-analyses, which are studies upon studies. So he's taken the last 50 years of educational research that include over 50,000 studies, almost 500 million students, to determine what really has influenced learning and achievement at the highest levels. And he uses a formula called effect size, which will allow, for example, when we use the California Achievement Assessment, now the SBAC, and compare dissertations and studies and educational research that might use the TIMSS or the NAEP or anywhere across the country or across the world to have a common measure when we're looking at what was the impact on student learning. What John Hattie found is the typical effect of everything we do is 0.4. The average effect of everything we do in school is 0.4 growth. The way to think about that is 0.4 growth is approximately 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. Now, what's more important than to get into the specific mathematical elements of it, which you're welcome to do, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent webinar, but to realize that when we're measuring achievement and growth over time, we can't start at 0. Almost everything we do works. Anything less than 0.4 is less than average. And so what Hattie did is he was able to find what he calls in his barometer of influences, things that actually had reverse effects. They've made learning go backwards. Things that when they were put in place, they had what you might call developmental effects. We would expect that growth in the course of a year. Basically, if the child is breathing, all you need is a beating heart. What he calls typical teacher effects, it's not a critique. His compliment is that almost 95% of everything he found actually impacts student achievement in a positive way. And some things aren't designed to affect achievement that way, so it's really compliment to teachers. But anything less than 0.4 is less than average. So we need to be searching for things that are above that 0.4 into what he calls the zone of desired effects. Another way to think about the impact of his research is that imagine if I said there's going to be 3.0 earthquakes in the Fresno area in the next 2 weeks, or 9.5. If there was going to be 10 3.0 earthquakes, we don't think that adds up to 30, do we? You're multiplied. But 9.5 would really capture our attention because the magnitude of that one. So when we see things that have had a huge impact on learning, we can really accelerate learning at a great level if we use those tools and use them well and monitor how they're working. So now I'm going to put the list back up. And I'm going to go through several of these throughout our session today. But now's a chance to pause the recording and not just look at how they're ranked against each other, but to remember that 0.4. That anything less than 0.4 is actually less than average. Pause the recording here as long as you'd like. Have a discussion with your peers. What captures your attention? What surprises you? I'm going to walk through several of these. And at the very end, of course, when I put my email up, please feel free to send me any thoughts or questions that you have that I might not have gone into detail about this or any other points of the research you've come across. Pause the recording as long as you need. I'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. So hopefully you had a chance to pause the recording, dig deeper into some of your reflections of what you thought, and remember 0.4 was the average. Now, an important point before I dig into some of these. Every one of Hattie's research elements like this, for example, questioning or mastery learning or direct instruction, is that influence, the studies around that, independent of the other ones. And then 0.71, 0.61, those are the average of all of the studies. So when we see something that has the average of 1.57, realize that certain times it was above that. And things that might be at negative 0.34, even times it was even lower and worse than that. So now we're going to dig in. And something important to note is that out of all of Hattie's research, he divided it into what he would maybe call houses. The curriculum. There's things that the student brings to the table. The school. The home life. And then, of course, the teacher and the approaches to teaching. And it's important, we're going to talk about the approaches to teaching that teachers do, the beliefs that we come to the table, the mind frame, so to speak. I'm going to start off with mobility, which is ranked last. What I mean by that is, as of right now, whatever number Hattie's up to, 220, 230, mobility always comes in dead last. It's the worst thing that can happen to a student. They start the year in Central, they go over to Clovis, they actually go to the central part of the state, and then maybe even come back later throughout the year. And I know we have a lot of those students. Can't control that. What you see here is the number of studies. That's the number of dissertations that Hattie used in his research around mobility. The effects were the number of indicators within the research that he found in terms of math achievement. Math achievement, boys and girls. Math achievement, boys and girls, if they were free and reduced lunch, and migrant population. So you see how it could expand in terms of the number of effects within the research. But then we have to dig in. Certainly negative 0.34 is almost 2 years growth backwards from the average. Something's very interesting within the study. They found, and this is something that isn't much of a shock, but when students make a peer friend within 48 hours, it almost negates the negative impact and takes it down to 0. So when we think about students who come into our school and they're mobile, I was a middle school administrator where we need to get them RTI'd, we need to get them universally assessed, got to get them into a classroom, they're behind. Not yet. Let's give them a peer friend to shadow for a couple of days. Let's make sure they have a student that they could connect with and sit with at lunch and have a safe, friendly face on the second day of school, and all the things that really matter for that student having an safe, affective belief about my school before we ever worry about learning. And then thinking about parents. Those of us that have been in the same school or school system for several years, we know the lay of the land. We know who we need to talk to, who we need to connect with. These parents have had a lot of gaps in their relationships in terms of school connections and to know what to do. And so we create newcomer events, but don't just do it at the start of the year, throughout the year. So my point is we can take something like mobility, the worst thing that can happen to a student, and even dig in a little bit and go, okay, even though we can't control that, there's things we can do to mitigate that. I also want to address for a moment, it's not on your list to jot anything down, but retention. Retention is also not as deleterious as mobility, but there's never been a study that links retention to increases in achievement and learning. There hasn't been one. And any that you find, if you dig deeper very often, what you see within the research was that they looked at achievement from one grade level to the next with a different set of peers, or they had gains which were lost within several years. But I do know a family that had 3 children. They had 12, 13, and then the proverbial accident. The boy was about 13 years younger than the rest of the family. And when he got to 3rd grade, he was starting to struggle academically. He passed. The school promoted him. But his mom and dad said, no, this isn't working. Well, we're seeing some things we want to address. So the mom and dad came in and they said, we're not asking. We're telling that we're going to ask for a different teacher and that he's going to be in the upper level math group because he was bored. And BORED with a BOY, that equals BAD real fast. I've got 3 in my own house. I know that. Student had a pretty good year, and even though his wife disagrees, I can't use the evidence on retention to disagree with it because I think I turned out okay. I have an anecdote. I went through 3rd grade twice for many different reasons. I can't look at the mountain of research on retention and go, well, I don't agree with that. That will happen to us when we look at Hattie's evidence. My grandfather lived to be 98, and there probably wasn't a day after 18 that he didn't smoke 3 cigars and eat bacon and drink a lot of whiskey. Doesn't mean I can sit there and say, see, it's not a bad habit to have if you want to have good health. It's an example. So as we go into the research, we've got to be cautious of what our personal beliefs are and what we might not have dug into even more when we look at some of the studies. So take a moment and look at homework. Homework comes in at 0.29. But when we look at homework, we have to be very cautious because at almost all level, it has a greater impact the older the student is. You know who does my 1st grader's homework? Me. Because he has the attention span of a gnat. He can't concentrate. He can't focus. It's not a bad idea that teachers are giving him things to work on that his parents are going to help him with. What they can't do is mark that down to achievement and learning. The other thing that will happen is my wife will check all of his homework and make sure he's getting the problems right before he goes into school. And the teacher could easily erroneously think, well, Zachary understands everything. The older students get, it does have an impact on learning, but assigning homework isn't doing it. We have to dig in here again. And when we dig into the research on homework, there's some things that are pretty obvious. My father would call this a blinding flash of the obvious. It has a greater impact for higher ability students than lower ability students. The more a student can perform the task, complete it, it's going to help his or her confidence, not their self-esteem, but their confidence. If they can't, it actually makes it go backwards and make them think that they can't perform. Here is the alpha and the omega, though. Task-oriented homework. Deep learning and problem-solving lesser effects. Things that have rote practice, rehearsal. We're doing the same task over and over to develop that muscle memory. Then we're going to see the greatest impact. Project-based conceptual learning, least effective. Now, this doesn't mean students aren't going home and working on a piece of quote-unquote their project. But if they're having to teach themselves and conceptually learn, that's why they need the teacher. That's not homework. We need the teacher there to help them. So what part of a project might they be doing that we've worked on? And that's what we want them to do, not teach themselves. The next quote is from Hattie, and I think we can't disagree with it, that a lack of homework, a lot of homework and a lack of monitoring is ineffective teaching. We see high effects in math. We see lower in science and social studies, maybe because it's more designed in math to be task-oriented. Here's an example of a policy, and I think it really highlights how we can create policy that actually could get away from what's in the research. Or one like this where it says homework should be purposeful and meaningful to the students, and here's some legitimate purposes. Now, teachers are responsible for assigning homework that is appropriate and differentiated as needed. As needed. If every student is getting the same homework assignment every night, something's wrong. If they're getting a different homework assignment every night, that could be a little bit crazy too. But maybe we go into a unit and think we're going to start at the beginning assuming everybody's on the same level, but as they show different levels of proficiency or a lack thereof, then the type of homework or what they're getting is going to meet their needs because it's not the completion of it. Homework should be for practice, practicing a skill. Not every student needs the same number of practices. And as a footnote, we don't grade practice. We don't grade and evaluate practice anywhere except sometimes we do in our classrooms. We have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the homework? And while some of us might think students are only motivated if we grade it and give them points, that's a learned behavior. What I would challenge is that the thing that's a greater motivator than points is less work. The more proficient you are, the less homework you have. So now we got to dig in even more to some of these. I want to highlight, especially at the elementary level, reading recovery programs. It comes in at 0.55, which is still above the average. But 0.55 is actually a misnomer when we dig into the research, because it's not about combining sentences or whole language. When it's a supplement rather than a substitute for classroom teaching, when what they're reading in the intervention is very similar to what they just read in the core instruction, that the same strategies are being used, that the same terminology is being used, that they're maybe reading that story again and going deeper with some close reading skills, it goes up to 0.96. So how we work with our elementary staff, where our intervention specialists and the teachers that are pulling the students out have a tight connection with what happened in the core reading instruction block, that's what's critical. And so here's another example where 0.55, hey, we'll take it, but 0.55 really is misleading because it's not what we do in terms of the whole language, it's how we apply it in terms of making sure that it's supplementing versus substituting. A couple more, and I like to combine these two. Direct instruction, 0.59. Problem-based learning, 0.15. Kind of a surprise, isn't it? That direct instruction would be 4 times the growth of problem-based learning. Well, here's where we need this guy again. We need the rest of the story. When we dig into direct instruction, it's not what I'm doing now in a sense, which is talking and lecturing in a sense into the computer screen and you following along. It actually has 7 distinct steps. And when we look at direct instruction and we think about it, look at steps 1 and 2. The teacher has a clear idea of the learning intention and communicates that with the students. They build commitment and engagement with the students. It sounds a lot like Madeline Hunter. There's specific ways that we should be teaching pedagogically, but number 5 is critical. That we provide enough guided practice, that we allow the students the ability to show us that they're getting it before they move on. Number 6, really I think at the elementary level is a little bit easier. We have classrooms that are set up where there's a reading station and students physically go over to the reading station. They read, then they come back to a different setting in the classroom. They have a change of scenery, so to speak. The brain gets signaled, hey, we're going to do something different. In the high school level or middle school, sometimes we ask, are there any questions? And there's not much of a transition. Number 7, students have time for independent practice, and the lack of it is the primary reason for a large amount of student failure. Let's go back to problem-based learning. Here's why it has been ineffective. It's not that we should abandon problem-based learning. When students lack surface-level knowledge, when they can probe into the deeper learning, it can actually have negative effects. If we're giving students a problem to solve and we haven't given them the tools to help solve it, and they don't have that surface knowledge, they'll be impeded in their learning. In addition, when students are ready for the problem, but they have to jump through a bunch of proverbial hoops, that also can impede their ability to apply concepts. It's extremely effective when students have deep understanding as they're diving into of surface knowledge when they go into the deeper challenges. It goes back to number 5 here. Are we making sure before we give them the deeper problem that we're helping them understand that surface knowledge? That's why you got to have a certain amount of math fact knowledge, a certain amount of vocabulary, a certain amount of whatever it is before we start to solve the problem, where I might have to help and support you more. A couple more. Teacher-student relationships. John Hattie's intentional that the word teacher comes first. The emphasis is for us to implement the relationship. And I make a joke that I understand that some students are more likable than others. I know this because I had my first son born when I was 36. There were 4 names left. Those of you that didn't laugh, that's a time-release joke. We all understand there's some students that they're more difficult to like or easier to like. But the key is when we look at teacher-student relationships, it has what he calls moderating effects. Empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is acknowledging that child is hungry, and I don't really allow food in my class, but I'm going to let him eat his donut. But I'm not going to let him go to recess today because I got to help support him because I'm not going to lower the standard. Non-directivity is where I don't force the learning of the student, meaning once you show me a certain amount of surface level knowledge, I will allow you some say in the learning. I don't demand that you show me the only way to learn it is through my one task or my one assignment. I give you choice and options, and I let your learning develop over time. I don't make every mistake count in the grade book. I don't just say you have to complete my 27 math problems. You need to be able to complete 7 correctly, and when you do that, you're finished. And I think most of us would think about how we model some of our, or this embraces us when we look at our bosses or our supervisors. We want them to give us enough direction so we know where to go. We don't like to be micromanaged. It doesn't change when we're 6 or 7 or 15, but our bosses don't say you get to just do whatever you want. There's an amount of direction that we should give, but at what point in time should we allow some freedom in how students are reaching their learning goals? Professional development, it's another one that I wanted to highlight. My standing comment is that I'm glad it's above 0.4 because it's job security for me. Professional development must meet these 6 criteria. It must be job embedded. It must involve, not that I'm the expert, but I bring some external expertise to the table to where I can see things in Central, other places that you might not be able to catch because you live here every day. We hire interior decorators to come to our house and see things that we couldn't see. We must challenge existing beliefs. We must make sure that it's not supporting the status quo, that it's getting us to think differently. And then those last 2 in the bottom right, all are related to effective professional learning community environments, that we're allowing teachers to talk to peers, that school leadership is supporting us as teachers in developing this during the school day, that we have time to plan and we have time to work together. And that might mean moving the schedule around sometimes so we give teachers longer chunks of time to plan and develop together. And finally, what we would call the new number 1, the one that replaced, in a sense, student expectations and assessment capable learners, collective teacher efficacy. 1.57, 4 times the average, 4 times growth in terms of 1 year. Collective teacher efficacy is when we collectively believe that if we promote our actions, or if we put our actions together and put the best effort forward and really look at what we're doing, we will have the best chance to have our students be as successful as possible. But it's more important here when I highlight this is to not know the definition, because it's not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya and just saying we'll go over to the collective teacher efficacy bus and buy as much as we can. Collective teacher efficacy is promoted when these 3 things are in place. First, there's mastery learning of the adults. The adults have to apply new knowledge. We have to be able to take some of these concepts that we're learning in formative assessment, PLCs, and visible learning, and practice them and get really good at them. Because if we don't develop mastery, we're not going to put it into place in our classroom. That takes time. There's positive interdependence. The number 1 thing as 3rd grade or 4th grade or 10th grade teachers right now that is impacting your success with the students you have is how well their 2nd grade or their 3rd grade or their 9th grade teacher last school year taught, assessed, provided effective feedback, etc. What we do impacts our peers. What our peers do impacts us. We have to have professional discourse with them on a consistent basis as we're monitoring their actions and they're monitoring ours. And then finally, we're having fine-grained discourse around student learning. We're deeply looking at student work, and not just numbers and data, but we're digging into the work and looking at why would students have been making this mistake? What could I have missed? What learning gap is taking place, or what learning piece is actually in place that we want to build upon? Finally, to summarize, what Hattie was able to do is to say, we look at all the percentage of the achievement variance with students. Here's how it breaks out. Most of us aren't going to be surprised they're in charge. Students bring more to the table that impacts their learning in a positive or negative way. In a school, it's us, the classroom teacher. When I say us, it's not me, it's you, the classroom teacher. Teachers have to pull the great stuff out of the students, the things that will impact learning even more, and try and minimize some of the challenges. Certainly the home life matters, and peers and the school and the principal. Students, they bring more to the table, and I think we know this. But in the school and the classroom, it's the teacher, which is why developing teacher learning and expertise is so very important. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you this overview or review of the visible learning research. If you have a chance, shoot me an email with any questions that you have, but hopefully you had a chance to dig into what the research tells us, what it doesn't, and then I've given you an overview of several of the studies where you can go deeper. And I always challenge and encourage anyone who's interested in any of the things I shared or any of the lists that you've seen, you've got to go into the actual micro studies. You got to go into the sub effects that are there that will help you see, oh, these were the things that really impacted the learning. It wasn't the 0.72, it was the non-directivity. It was the making sure in problem-based learning that we check for surface level knowledge. It was those pieces that is so very critical. Thank you so much. I look forward to talking with all of you soon. Have a great rest of your day.